Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're cozy, the lights are dimmed, and your brain is ready to be gently massaged by the sound of rhythmic, low-stakes historical narration. Tonight we're taking a very long, slow boat ride across the North Sea. We're going to dive into the world of the Vikings. Now, when you hear Viking, you probably think of huge, shouting, bearded men and horned helmets, which of course they absolutely did not wear. That's a later, very dramatic, and totally inaccurate piece of historical branding. We're going to ignore the loud drama and focus instead on the much quieter, much more sleep-inducing realities. The reasons why they left home, the mundane details of their settlements, and the quiet brilliance of their shipbuilding. The central historical problem with the Vikings is simple. Were they bloodthirsty raiders who smashed up monasteries? Or were they clever explorers and traders who simply had a slight, unfortunate habit of occasional violence? The answer, as always in history, is boringly both, and we're going to spend the next hour and a half gently exploring the balance. The quiet pressure. Why leave Scandinavia? To understand the Vikings, we need to start not on a ship, but in the quiet, rocky fjords of Scandinavia around the late 8th century. The standard image is that these people were just inherently aggressive, but the truth is usually a little more complicated and frankly a little more boringly economic. Around 790 AD, several slow, quiet changes were happening that made staying home less and less appealing. Population growth and land scarcity. The population of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark was slowly increasing. The terrain in large parts of Scandinavia is notoriously rugged and poor for large-scale agriculture. If you're a farmer and your land can barely feed your current family, it certainly can't be neatly subdivided among 3 or 4 sons when you die. This creates a predictable, low-level pressure cooker situation. For the younger sons, the simple, sensible economic option was to leave. You simply packed up your family and went somewhere where the taxes weren't so annoying. The rise of centralized power. In places like Norway, ambitious local chieftains were slowly, messily trying to consolidate power and establish small kingdoms. If you were a free-spirited, independent farmer, bondi, who didn't want to bend your knee or pay taxes to the new guy trying to set himself up as a king, the most dignified, quiet solution was, again, to leave. You simply packed up your family and went somewhere where the taxes weren't so annoying. Trade routes. The Vikings were always involved in local trade, but they slowly realized they had a key piece of technology that gave them an advantage over everyone else on the continent: the longship. The longship, the true hero of the story. The true sleep-inducing genius of the Viking Age lies not in the sword, but in the boat. The Viking longship was arguably the single most important piece of naval technology in Europe during this period, and its design is a quiet marvel of engineering efficiency. Imagine a single perfect wooden hull. Shallow draft. This is the key. Their boats only drew a few feet of water. This meant that they could not only cross the open, unpredictable ocean, but they could also sail right up shallow rivers, beach quickly onto sand, or even be carried short distances over land. This versatility gave them a massive tactical advantage. Clinker construction. This sounds complicated, but it's just a repetitive, rhythmic building method. It means the planks of the hull overlap like roofing shingles. This makes the hull light, extremely flexible, and incredibly strong, perfect for navigating rough seas without falling apart. Power and speed. They were powered by both a single square sail for long-distance boring cruising and by oarsmen for speed and maneuverability when they reached a river or a coast. The longship wasn't just a raiding vessel, it was an incredibly efficient multi-purpose vehicle. It was the ultimate quiet enabler of both exploration and economic migration. The beginning of the noise, Lindisfarne, 793 AD. The traditional starting date for the Viking Age is 793 AD. This is the date of the infamous raid on Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria in England. Lindisfarne was an ancient, quiet, and incredibly wealthy monastery. It was also strategically undefended. Monasteries were perfect targets. Why?
because Christian morality dictated that wealth was to be stored for the glory of God, often in the form of beautiful gold, silver, and precious liturgical objects. Monks didn't fight back. They were, in a word, easy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the raid in predictable horror. Heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The entire event was a quick, brutal, and highly profitable smash and grab. This single act of targeted violence provided two crucial things for the Vikings: a proof of concept and a terrible reputation. It showed that the rich, fertile, disorganized, and easily accessible Christian lands were vulnerable. And the image of the Viking as a monstrous, destructive heathen was instantly cemented across Christian Europe. This reputation would follow them, regardless of whether they were next arriving as a raider or simply a very aggressive merchant. It's important to remember that for every one of these dramatic, noisy raids, there were dozens of quiet, boring trade journeys. But history, as we know, always favors the dramatic over the economic reality. The quiet drift west, Iceland. The Viking expansion wasn't a military plan. It was a slow, disorganized drift, driven by individual initiative and the need for grazing land. The ultimate destination for the tax dodgers and the discontented farmers was the empty, quiet expanse of the North Atlantic. The discovery and settlement of Iceland is perhaps the most peaceful and enduring of the Viking sagas. Iceland was discovered, likely by accident, around the mid-9th century. By the end of the century, waves of settlers were arriving, mostly from Norway, escaping the consolidating power of King Harald Fairhigh. These settlers weren't raiders, they were land-seeking migrants. They brought their families, their livestock, and their entire political system. And what a dull, predictable political system it was. In Iceland, they established the Althing, the world's first functioning parliament. The Althing wasn't a place for kings or centralized power. It was an annual, 2-week-long legal gathering where the powerful chieftains, Godar, would meet to pass laws, settle disputes, and arrange marriages. It was a massive, annual, bureaucratic gathering dedicated entirely to the peaceful, monotonous settlement of disagreements. They were so obsessed with law that they even created the role of the law speaker, whose job was to literally recite the entire legal code over the course of 3 years. Imagine the monotonous effort required to memorize the entire massive legal text just to ensure that everyone knew the rules for land ownership and inheritance.
I hope the thought of Icelandic law speakers reciting endless legal codes is successfully making your eyes heavy. We've established that the Viking Age was largely driven by economic pressure and enabled by excellent shallow draft longships. Now let's drift even further west, across the quiet, cold expanse of the North Atlantic. Eric the Red, the quiet criminal. The next quiet, predictable step in the Viking westward drift was the discovery and settlement of Greenland. And the man who led that effort wasn't a noble explorer. He was essentially an exiled criminal. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Eric the Red. Eric wasn't just a quiet, disgruntled Norwegian farmer. He was a violent, low-stakes hothead who specialized in getting exiled. He was exiled from Norway for manslaughter after getting into a fight with his neighbor. Standard Viking squabble. He moved with his family to Iceland, where, after a few years of quiet farming, he got into another similar low-stakes dispute over some house timbers. The dispute escalated, someone else ended up dead, another predictable manslaughter, and Eric was exiled from Iceland for 3 years by the Althing. So, Eric was banished, and instead of sulking or apologizing, he decided, well, I'll just go find a whole new country. Because, why not? It's the ultimate passive-aggressive response to a legal judgment. Around 985 AD, Eric the Red led a small flotilla of ships, not to raid, but to settle. He intentionally gave this new, vast, largely ice-covered land the incredibly misleading name of Greenland. This was perhaps the first great historical act of real estate marketing fraud. The name wasn't meant to describe the landscape. It was meant to attract reluctant settlers from Iceland and Norway. It's a very quiet, very dry joke on prospective buyers. The settlement of Greenland wasn't a glorious adventure. It was a slow, incredibly marginal existence. The Vikings settled two main areas, the eastern settlement and the western settlement, both located in the sheltered fjords of the southwest, where the climate was just mild enough to allow for pasture and minimal farming. For nearly 500 years, these settlements existed, totally dependent on predictable seasonal activities: raising sheep and cattle on meager grass, hunting seals and seabirds, trading luxury items like walrus ivory with Europe. The entire existence was a constant grinding struggle against the cold and marginal resources. It was a long, slow exercise in survival, a truly non-dramatic example of how tough life was when you couldn't find good farmland. Leif Erikson and the accidental discovery of America. Eric the Red had a son named Leif Erikson. Leif, being a restless young man, decided that the quiet, predictable life of hunting seals in Greenland was boring. The traditional story says that Leif was heading back to Greenland from Norway, where he had converted to Christianity, a significant, quiet event in his life, when his ship was blown off course. He missed Greenland and entirely by accident landed on the coast of North America. Leif explored three distinct areas, which he gave incredibly literal, sleep-inducing names: Helluland, Flat Stone Land, probably Baffin Island; Markland, Forest Land, probably Labrador; and Vineland, or perhaps Pasture Land, probably Newfoundland, specifically the area around L'Anse aux Meadows. The discovery of America by the Vikings around 1000 AD was not a massive geopolitical event. It was a quiet, accidental footnote. The Vikings weren't looking to conquer continents. They were looking for lumber, a desperately scarce resource in treeless Greenland. Leif Erikson and his crew spent one very cold, very quiet winter in Vineland, cut down some trees, and then, with predictable logic, went home. They simply returned to Greenland because despite the lack of trees, that's where the main settlement and their families were. It was an extremely pragmatic, non-adventurous end to the discovery of a continent. The squabble in Vineland, the saga of Freydis Eriksson. The most dramatic event related to Vineland, and it's still a very quiet drama, concerns Leif's half-sister, Freydis Eriksson. Freydis, a strong-willed and famously aggressive woman, decided to lead an expedition back to Vineland to settle permanently. She organized the trip with two Icelandic brothers, and, in classic family style, they all immediately hated each other upon arrival. The entire settlement attempt was ruined not by the indigenous people, whom the Vikings called the Skraelings, but by a petty, low-stakes sibling squabble over who had the best sleeping quarters and who got to keep the most profit from the voyage. The sagas describe how Freydis, in a fit of rage, used an axe to kill her rivals and their entire crew. When she returned to Greenland, Leif Erikson was told about the violence. His reaction? Not a massive punishment, but a quiet, passive-aggressive one. He simply said he would not associate with her anymore and predicted that her descendants would come to little. It's the ultimate Viking version of cutting a troublesome relative out of the family will. The takeaway from the whole Vineland episode is crucial and very dull. The Vikings failed to colonize America not because of superior native forces or massive obstacles, but because they couldn't stop fighting among themselves over minor real estate and profit margins. They retreated back to the predictable stability of the Greenland settlements, never to return. The settlement of Greenland quietly faded away entirely by the 15th century, defeated by a subtle shift in climate that made the growing of even meager grass impossible. It wasn't conquered. It simply froze to death in a slow, centuries-long process of quiet, predictable starvation. Let the slow, chilling sound of the shifting glaciers and the long, non-committal legal debates of the Althing settle you deeper into your rest. We've established the quiet nature of Viking exploration. Now, let's glide over to the other side of the North Sea to see where they focused their attention when they weren't getting exiled.
I hope the tales of manslaughter and failed real estate ventures in Greenland have settled your mind. We're now turning our attention from the sparsely populated, peaceful North Atlantic to the much more densely populated, slightly chaotic lands of Europe. This is where the Vikings transitioned from disorganized raiders into something much more complex and, frankly, much more administratively annoying: conquerors and settlers. The Great Heathen Army. Not an army, but a bureaucracy. In the year 865 AD, something entirely new appeared on the horizon of Anglo-Saxon England. It wasn't a handful of longships doing a quick smash and grab like at Lindisfarne. It was a massive, sustained influx of fighters and settlers called the Great Heathen Army. The name itself sounds terrifying, but the reality was more like a large-scale, slow-moving migrant workforce with weapons. Why did they arrive? The raids of the previous century had revealed that England was rich, fragmented into competing kingdoms, and, crucially, had excellent farmland. The Vikings were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for better soil. This was a land grab disguised as a military campaign. The army wasn't a unified military force under a single general. It was actually a large coalition of war bands led by a group of brothers and cousins who had names that sounded suitably rough, like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Guthrum. These leaders were constantly fighting among themselves, splitting up the spoils and making complex, shifting agreements. It was more like a slightly aggressive, decentralized cooperative of land speculators. Their strategy wasn't dramatic battle. It was strategic, slow, quiet occupation. They didn't march around endlessly. They seized horses and moved inland quickly. They took entire towns and wintered there, settling in for months at a time. They didn't destroy all the Anglo-Saxon systems. They simply replaced the local landlord with a Viking one. This was less a military invasion and more a change of ownership. By the 870s, they had destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, replacing the ruling houses with puppet kings or direct Viking control. Alfred the Great, the king who learned to wait. The only Anglo-Saxon kingdom that held out against this relentless, slow tide was Wessex, led by King Alfred. Alfred's story is the perfect example of non-dramatic, strategic genius. He didn't win by charging into battle repeatedly. He won by being boringly competent and patient. After initially losing badly and being forced to hide in the marshes of Athelney, the famous story where he supposedly burnt the peasant woman's cakes, Alfred realized he couldn't beat the Vikings in a decisive battle. So he changed the problem. He established a system of fortified towns called burhs. These were not fancy castles. They were boringly efficient, square earthenwork fortifications built strategically across his kingdom, each supplied with food and garrisoned by local levies. The purpose of the burhs was simple: deny the Vikings easy targets and force them to engage in long, drawn-out sieges, which the Vikings, being restless and short on patience, hated. Alfred's strength was in boring, defensive planning and bureaucratic organization. The conflict ended not with a great cinematic battle, but with a peace treaty in 878 AD, the Treaty of Wedmore. Alfred forced the Viking leader, Guthrum, to convert to Christianity, a purely political move, and recognized the Viking occupation of the eastern half of England. This occupied territory became known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw was not a place of endless violence. It was a place where two legal and administrative systems quietly merged. The Viking settlers, mostly Danish, brought their own legal customs. They favored juries, clear and standardized laws, and a system based on fines rather than executions. The administrative center of the Danelaw was the 5 boroughs: Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Stamford, and Lincoln. These were organized, functional trade and settlement centers. For over half a century, England was essentially split in half: Wessex, run by the Anglo-Saxons, and the Danelaw, run by the Vikings. It was a region of peaceful, repetitive agriculture and legal integration. If you were a quiet farmer in the Danelaw, life went on. You paid your tax, you followed the law, and your descendants slowly merged with the existing Anglo-Saxon population. The sound of law courts arguing over land deeds eventually replaced the sound of raiding axes. The quiet siege of Paris and the Frankish humiliation. While the Danes were busy settling England, another group of Vikings, mostly Norwegians and others, turned their longships towards the wealthy but increasingly fragmented Frankish-French kingdoms. The most famous encounter here is the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886. A massive Viking fleet of hundreds of longships, led by the predictable, aggressive chieftain Siegfried, sailed up the river Seine. The goal wasn't to capture Paris as a capital. It was to extort money to let them pass further inland to raid richer lands. It was less a military campaign and more a river toll shakedown. Paris at the time was small, but strategically located on an island. The defenses were led by a competent local count, Odo. The siege dragged on for a massive, frustrating 13 months. This siege was not a glorious, dramatic spectacle. It was a long, monotonous standoff. The Vikings tried various methods: fire, siege engines, undermining the walls, but the city held, largely through stubborn, boring defense. The siege ended in the most anticlimactic way possible: humiliation for the Frankish king. The emperor of the Franks, Charles the Fat, finally arrived with a massive army, not to attack the Vikings, but to pay them to leave. Charles gave the Vikings 700 pounds of silver and, in a breathtaking display of cowardice, gave them permission to sail past Paris to raid Burgundy, a region that was currently in revolt against him. He literally used the Vikings to attack his political enemies. The Vikings took the silver and sailed away. The entire year-long siege ended with cash payment and a temporary license to loot. It was a massive, quiet surrender to administrative inefficiency. The true winner of the siege wasn't Odo or the Vikings, but the sheer, monotonous financial power of silver. And on that note of Frankish diplomatic failure, let's let the sounds of axes and silver coins clinking settle you into a deeper rest. The Vikings, whether in England or in France, were proving that persistence and excellent logistical planning often beat chaotic heroism.
I hope the low hum of Viking bureaucracy in the Danelaw is still gently rocking you. We've covered the West, Iceland, Greenland, and England, but the Vikings' most significant, least understood, and arguably most boringly productive expansion was to the east. This is where they stopped being just raiders and started becoming the founders of nations and bodyguards to emperors. The eastern route, from traders to rulers. The Vikings who ventured east were primarily Swedes, whom the Slavic people called the Rus, a term which eventually gave its name to Russia. Their motivation here was purely trade, specifically the insatiable European demand for fur and the huge Middle Eastern demand for slaves. They followed the major river systems of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Don, using their versatile longships. But these rivers weren't continuous. The greatest challenge was the portages, the stretches where the ships had to be unloaded and physically dragged overland between river systems. Imagine the tedious, rhythmic labor, unloading tons of cargo, carrying a 60-foot boat over muddy terrain, reloading and starting the slow, repetitive paddling again. It's a marathon of logistical monotony. The Vikings established a vast trade network that stretched from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the two great rich hubs of the age, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Along these routes, the Rus set up trading posts that slowly evolved into permanent settlements and eventually major cities like Novgorod and Kiev. The creation of the first Slavic state, Kievan Rus, was essentially a quiet, gradual transformation of the Swedish Vikings from trade bosses into ruling elite. The local Slavic tribes, who were constantly fighting among themselves, apparently decided that it was simply less effort to have the hyper-organized armed Viking traders take charge and establish stable tax collection than to continue their endless internal squabbles. The traditional date for the founding of the Rus is the mid-9th century, when the chroniclers tell us that the local people invited a Viking chieftain named Rurik to come rule them. The Vikings didn't so much conquer Eastern Europe as they were hired to run the local governments. It's the ultimate example of the Viking as the hyper-competent, slightly aggressive management consultant. The Varangian Guard, the Viking as imperial bodyguard. The most fascinating and arguably most peaceful life for an Eastern Viking was in the service of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. Constantinople was the wealthiest, most sophisticated city in Europe. The Byzantines, being famously suspicious of their own native soldiers, often preferred to hire big, strong, utterly foreign men who had no local political ties to protect their emperor. And who was bigger, stronger, and more foreign than a Norseman from the far north? These Vikings were hired into the emperor's elite personal security detail, known as the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was not an invasion force. It was a highly paid, highly disciplined police unit. They were essentially the emperor's extremely loyal, incredibly scary private security. They were paid handsomely in gold and were famous for their distinctive fighting style, wielding the massive Dane axe. Their job description was simple, repetitive, and very prestigious. Guard the emperor day and night, stand watch outside the imperial treasury, march in ceremonial parades. The highest point of their drama was during a palace coup, where their main job was often to stand stone-faced and execute whichever court official was currently losing the political fight. It was a life of long, boring, profitable duty, occasionally punctuated by moments of extreme, controlled violence. Many young Norsemen traveled the long, slow river route to Constantinople, seeking fortune. They called the journey the Road to the East, and they called Constantinople itself Miklagard, the great city. The goal was to serve for a few years, earn a massive amount of gold. The pay was excellent, plus they got to loot the emperor's rooms after he died, a unique perk, and return home rich enough to retire to a nice quiet farm in Norway or Iceland. The quiet irony is that the most direct way for a Viking to achieve wealth and retirement was not through the chaos of raiding, but by becoming a civil servant in the most advanced empire of the age. The end of the runes, Christianity, and cultural quietness. Around the 10th and 11th century, the Viking Age began its long, predictable, quiet end driven primarily by one thing: the relentless advance of Christianity. Christianity wasn't an army. It was an incredibly powerful, organized, and centralizing political force. For kings, conversion to Christianity gave ambitious Scandinavian chiefs, like those in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a powerful unifying ideology and a centralized administrative structure, the church, that they could use to levy taxes and consolidate their power. This effectively ended the era of disgruntled individuals simply leaving the country. For trade, to trade effectively with the vast, rich kingdoms of Europe, England, France, the German states, it was simply safer and more profitable to be a Christian. A Norse merchant who was Christian could trade anywhere. A Norse merchant who was a pagan was always treated as a potential enemy and target. The conversion of Scandinavia was a long, messy, quiet process that often took centuries. It resulted in the slow, permanent domestication of the Viking world. They stopped writing in the difficult-to-carve runes and adopted the easier, more widespread Latin alphabet. They stopped building longships for raiding and started building knarrs, fatter, slower, dedicated cargo ships, perfect for boring, profitable bulk trade. The age of the loud, chaotic raid was over, replaced by the quiet, predictable rhythm of organized commerce and tax collection. The Viking became a farmer, a bureaucrat, a trader, and a Christian, a completely normalized, non-threatening European. The long, noisy saga ended with a quiet, efficient merger into the European economic system. And on that note of quiet cultural assimilation, let's let the repetitive motion of the portages, the rhythmic chanting of the Varangian Guard, and the relentless logic of profitable trade settle you into a deep, organized rest.
We're now gliding into the final, slightly absurd stage of Viking history, the phase where the fearsome Norse raiders decided that the truly profitable thing to do was to become French-speaking, feudal, bureaucratic landlords. This is the story of the Normans, and it's the quiet, organizational sequel to the messy raids. Rollo and the ultimate land deal. Our story starts in 911 AD on the coast of France, then still the fragmented kingdom of West Francia. The area around the mouth of the Seine River had been plagued for decades by relentless, repetitive Viking raids. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, a name that already suggests his diplomatic abilities, was completely worn down by the monotonous defense. The leader of the current Viking force was a formidable chieftain named Rollo. Rollo wasn't interested in a quick raid. He was interested in something much more permanent and boringly sensible: land ownership. Charles the Simple proposed the ultimate passive-aggressive land deal. He offered Rollo a large, fertile stretch of coastal territory centered around the city of Rouen. The terms of this contract were both simple and incredibly loaded. Rollo and his Vikings could keep the land, which was already essentially under their control anyway. In return, Rollo had to stop raiding the rest of France. Rollo had to convert to Christianity, a political formality. And, crucially, Rollo had to swear fealty to Charles and defend the mouth of the Seine from other Vikings.
It's the ultimate bureaucratic solution. Hire the problem to solve the problem. Rollo accepted. The area became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The quiet transformation from Norse to Norman. What happened next is one of the quickest, quietest, and most thorough cultural transformations in European history. Within 3 generations, Rollo's descendants and their followers completely abandoned their Norse language, religion, and customs. They didn't just assimilate, they hyper-assimilated. They adopted the local French language, they became fiercely Catholic, they embraced the feudal system of land ownership. They kept their Viking aggression, but they channeled it into something much more organized, institutional, centralized feudal control. The Normans became famous across Europe not for their longships, but for their castles, their heavy cavalry, and their ruthlessly efficient administration. The Normans were Vikings who had essentially been re-engineered by French bureaucracy. They combined the Viking drive and logistical skill with the Frankish system of paperwork and heavy armor. They built huge stone keeps and motte and bailey castles, the ultimate expression of a stable, landowning ruling class. They stopped sailing the open ocean for plunder and started calculating vassal tax duties and military service requirements. It's the ultimate endpoint of the Viking Age. The noisy barbarian became the most meticulous, well-documented, and boringly successful landlord in Europe. The Norman export, invasion as bureaucracy. This efficiency made the Normans highly exportable. They weren't satisfied with just owning France. They wanted to take their particular brand of centralized, bureaucratic conquest elsewhere. The 2 great Norman exports of the 11th century were, of course, southern Italy and Sicily, the Mediterranean adventure. Around the year 1000 AD, small groups of ambitious Norman knights traveled to southern Italy, initially as mercenaries. They quickly realized that the region was fragmented and weak, controlled by Byzantines, Lombards, and Arabs. Over the next century, these Norman adventurers, led by figures like the de Hauteville brothers, systematically carved out a kingdom for themselves. They established the powerful kingdom of Sicily, famous for its tolerance, its fusion of Arab, Greek, and Latin cultures, and its highly centralized royal administration. They were Norsemen who ended up ruling a sunny, complex Mediterranean melting pot, proving that the Viking drive was perfectly compatible with detailed multilingual tax collection. England, the ultimate takeover. The most famous act of Normanization, of course, was the conquest of England in 1066 AD. The leader was William the Conqueror, a direct descendant of Rollo several generations removed. William wasn't a Viking raider. He was a highly sophisticated, financially ruthless French duke with a carefully prepared legal claim to the English throne. In 1066, the Norman Paperwork War. The invasion of England wasn't a chaotic barbarian raid. It was a carefully financed, logistically perfect corporate takeover. William spent months building his invasion fleet and meticulously gathering supplies. He obtained the Pope's blessing, the ultimate political green light. The actual invasion only occurred after the newly crowned English king, Harold Godwinson, had to march his army all the way to Northumbria to fight a different Viking invasion led by the Norse king Harald Hardrada, a true old-school Viking. After the Battle of Hastings, where William's organized cavalry defeated Harold's tired infantry, the conquest began. And this is where the Norman genius for boring administration shines. William did not just conquer, he systematically documented and reorganized every inch of the country. His greatest, most sleep-inducing achievement was the Domesday Book, 1086 AD. The Domesday Book was an immense, comprehensive survey of the entire English kingdom. It recorded in meticulous detail who owned what land, how many pigs, sheep, and plows were on the land, what the land was worth before the conquest, and what it was worth now. It was a complete, boringly accurate inventory of all English assets, designed purely to ensure efficient taxation. This document, which is still studied today, is the ultimate testament to the final evolution of the Viking, from savage raider to the world's most meticulous tax assessor in Europe. The noise of the axe was replaced by the relentless, quiet scratching of the scribe's quill.
We're settling in for the final, quiet thoughts on the Viking Age. We've seen the fearsome raider transform into the tax-collecting Norman landlord. Now, let's look at what the Vikings left behind, focusing on the quiet, enduring evidence found in archaeology and genetics. Archaeology, the mundane details of daily life. When historians look at Viking sites, they are often disappointed by the lack of massive, opulent gold troves. Instead, archaeology confirms the Viking Age was largely about mundane, repetitive tasks and trade. Consider the settlements in Britain, particularly in the Danelaw area. Excavations reveal things that are much less exciting than hidden treasure. Organized towns. York, Jorvik, the capital of Viking Northumbria, was a well-organized, thriving, filthy, but functional trade hub. Archaeologists find evidence of specialized crafts, comb-making from bone and antler, metalworking, and ship repair. It's the quiet, continuous sound of a productive economy that dominates the archaeological record. The scent of trade. The most common finds are coins, weights, and scales. This is the physical evidence that the Vikings were, first and foremost, meticulous merchants. They needed standardized weights because they rarely used pre-minted coins. They used silver as bullion, cutting it up and weighing it out for every transaction. This entire process speaks to a culture obsessed with precise, predictable exchange rates. The greatest quiet archaeological irony is found in their burials. While some high-status individuals got the famous ship burials, like the Oseberg ship, the vast majority of Vikings were buried quietly, non-dramatically, and then eventually converted to Christianity and were buried in quiet, predictable churchyards. Their noisy pagan identity was slowly, silently surrendered to the Christian standardization of death. Linguistic endurance, the quiet invasion of English. The Vikings might have lost their independent kingdoms in England, but their legacy endured in the most subtle, boring, and permanent way possible, the English language. When the Viking settlers merged with the Anglo-Saxons in the Danelaw, their languages merged too, in a quiet linguistic takeover. The Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, was structurally similar to Old Norse, so borrowing was easy. The words they gave us are not the dramatic ones, like warrior. They are the everyday, repetitive, crucial words that you can't go 5 seconds without using. Sky, take, get, give, sister, husband. Law, the ultimate symbol of their preference for legal structure. The ubiquitous they, them, and their, which replaced the much clumsier Old English versions. The Vikings made the language simpler, cleaner, and much more direct. The result is a quiet, permanent Viking victory that every English speaker enacts every day. It's the ultimate, pervasive, and utterly non-dramatic conquest. Genetic drift, the silent legacy of settlers. Finally, the most enduring and boringly scientific proof of Viking colonization is found in DNA. Genetic studies confirm that the Viking expansion was not just a passing wave of men. In areas of major settlement, Iceland, the Danelaw, especially around Yorkshire, and the Scottish Islands, there is a clear, quiet influx of Scandinavian genetic markers. This genetic evidence tells the final, quiet story. The vast majority of Vikings who went abroad were not just transient raiders. They were settlers
who brought their families, stayed put, and reproduced. They merged their bloodlines with the local population, slowly dissolving their Viking identity into the broader pool of English, Scottish, and Irish populations. The High Norse genetic contribution in Iceland confirms its status as a pure migrant colony. The Viking Age, therefore, ends not with a great battle or a shouting hero, but with quiet genetic assimilation. The noisy epoch of fire and fury dissolves into the long, slow, quiet process of biological integration. Final thought: the predictable end. The truth of the Vikings is that their story is defined by predictable logic. They left home for economic reasons, used ingenious, efficient longships, and settled into stable, tax-paying communities whenever possible. The raiding was just the most profitable, most convenient method of funding that underlying urge to settle and trade. The entire age began with a lack of farmland and ended when the descendants of the Vikings secured the best farmlands and established the most efficient tax-collecting bureaucracies in Europe. It's a massive story of ambition, reduced in the end to land ownership, logistics, and legal integration. Let the quiet certainty of DNA and the slow, rhythmic sound of a Viking merchant weighing his silver finally lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep. All that noise, all that travel, all for the ultimate, boring goal of a better farm and lower taxes. Sleep well. Part 7. Epilogue. The Vikings' lasting, quiet contribution. Welcome back for the final moments of our journey. We'll finish with one last tiny detail that truly captures the spirit of the Vikings' quiet, enduring contribution to the world: the standardized barrel. The standardization of trade, the barrel and the knar. As the Vikings transitioned from raiding to organized trade, they became obsessed with standardization. For a highly mobile merchant culture, having predictable, easily stackable, and universally accepted containers was crucial. Enter the barrel. While barrels existed before the Vikings, they mastered the coopering trade, barrel making, and refined the wooden cask as the ultimate shipping container for everything from fish and ale to honey and tar. The knar, the wider, slower, dedicated cargo ship that replaced the longship, was built to hold these barrels. The entire structure of the Viking maritime economy relied on the precise, repetitive, predictable size and shape of the barrel. It's the ultimate boring artifact of their economic genius. The Viking legacy, therefore, is not just the sword in the ground or the saga on the page, but the standardized container that allowed trade to flourish across the North Sea. It's a humble, functional, and deeply monotonous piece of logistics that fueled the wealth of medieval Europe, the quiet revolution of the easily stacked wooden cask. May the steady, rhythmic sound of barrels being rolled onto a knar and the quiet, efficient bureaucracy of the Norman tax collector provide the final peaceful soundscape for your rest. Sleep now.